Season 7 of the DBL is finally here, and that means it's time to rank and predict all team records, awards, and player performances for the upcoming campaign. With a bunch of turnover and exciting trades, the latest endeavor is shaping up to be the greatest season yet. We have no time to waste, you know how this shit goes. Let's get it started with number 12. In last place this year is going to be one of the 3 new members in the DBL, Eric Kussman, leading the Bespin Rebels with a 2-17 record. CJ returned to the DBL last season as an expansion team, finishing in 11th place with 2 wins through the whole campaign. You can't blame the guy, as we all know inheriting a new team is not easy, especially when you have to craft that team from the ground up against the backdrop of continuously elite rosters. It was to be expected and helped the Nice kind of concoct their vision for the future, but sadly CJ stepped away and retired for good, leaving this organization in a boatload of trouble. Luckily, Eric, who's brothers with a DBL legend in Josh, showed a lot of enthusiasm in joining the league and acquiring the Nice, rebranding to somewhere in a galaxy far, far away. Despite how passionate and committed Eric looks to be in the association for years to come, it's still going to be quite the uphill battle as a rookie in an extremely competitive league. Pair that with the fact that this roster is complete dog shit, the Rebels will have a slim chance at accumulating more than 3 wins. That's not Eric's fault, this was the hand he was dealt. Nobody's expecting Bespin to go out there and rack up W's, but there is at least hope that management dedicates themselves to carving out a future for this team and figuring out the environment within which this league operates. When we analyze these keepers, there simply isn't much hope for them to perform well. Kessler is obviously someone of note, but I'd still be slightly cautious considering he was held back in minutes as a second-year player when he had the entire center position to himself. That all changed last year to the tune of 28 fantasy points, but it's a little discouraging that the Jazz are openly shopping him when you'd think they want him as their center of the future. I think as long as he gets a solid workload, he should be in line to be an all-star caliber DBL player for years to come, but if he gets traded to a more legitimate team, his output could fluctuate, which worries me, being that he is so young. Derek White is clearly not the right kind of fit for this Bespin roster, but he should have a career year with Tatum out and Holiday off the team. I'm thinking somewhere between 22 and 23 fantasy points, as Eric can pawn him off at the deadline to a contender in need of additional support. Same with Kyrie, who is actually perfect in this Rebels lineup and situation. He will miss most of the season, so he won't assist Bespin in winning any games, and they don't want to, and he can be that veteran leadership in the locker room for the young fellas until he's traded for a better package than what Eric gave up to get him. Yves Messi is a second-year player that showed promise as a rookie, so I definitely support this keep as well, but it's not even guaranteed he'll start. Averaging 18 fantasy points as a rookie, though, is something worth applauding, and since the Pelicans players are always in and out of the hospital, he may have a good chance to bump his numbers up and average over 21 fantasy points. The first overall pick in the NBA draft last year didn't make much of an impact, but there's still reason to have some faith Risacher can turn it around, especially when you're in the position that Bespin is in. He was the first pick, there were games he flashed a serious scoring prowl, and he's going to continue to get looks and opportunities with Trae Young manning the offense. You can't write off second-year players, most notably when they were drafted first overall, so hopefully ZR can adjust and bump his fantasy statistics closer to 18 to 19 fantasy points. Jabari is intriguing because there may be something there, and he's still young, but he only averaged 17 fantasy points in 30 minutes last year, which was a downtick from 20 a season earlier. Not good, especially when you factor in the signing of Kevin Durant and extended development of Amin Thompson, Reed Shepherd, and Tari Eason. He can still improve, but I don't see him being a must-roster player at all. Next, we have Matas Buzelis, who was probably the least notable of everyone here throughout the entirety of last season. But he finished strong, and I would argue has more potential than most of Eric's other keepers. We don't know what's going to happen, but the Bulls are young, and I expect him to receive more minutes and touches. It may not be a fantastic second season, but if he can reach 15 to 16 fantasy points, that is a solid trajectory for Bespin and Buzelis. Last, and probably least in my opinion, would be Jordan Poole. Poole averaged 19 fantasy points last year, which is truthfully pretty respectable, but that was in a bounce back from his first season in Washington, which was actually disgusting. I doubt the change of scenery does anything for him either. He's not the worst player ever to roster, but I certainly wouldn't keep him, and I definitely wouldn't if you're the Rebels, since he has clearly peaked at this point. Overall, yeah, I can't say I really like this core. That is not Eric's fault, and I wholeheartedly believe he's doing the right thing by sticking with a young squad and not blowing up his draft compensation for one-year rentals, but I do not believe most of these players will be in Bespin by season's end. A handful could certainly improve, but there's a reason to believe many will remain stagnant. Risacher, Poole, Jabari, and Buzelis are not locks to get better by any stretch of the imagination, and even Missy, who I like, has some question marks. It remains to be seen, but I still praise the Rebels for employing the youth and essentially creating a tryout year to see who will stick around for the future. Sliding on over to Eric's inaugural draft, we begin with the number 2 overall pick in Dylan Harper. This was the consensus pick here that nobody is going to argue against, and it's perfect that he's going to the Rebels because Harper is not going to be very relevant in his first campaign. Playing with Fox and Castle, and obviously with so much offense being powered through Wemby, I can't see him doing too much in a fantasy context. Obviously the correct pick here though at this state in time. Eric did not select again until number 23, and unfortunately, he picked one of my most detested players in Bobby Portis. I'm over him, he's burned me one too many times, but I also don't think he's really worthy of such a high pick. He hasn't been that good the last few years, and the Rebels aren't going to get much from a veteran player that is just okay. If he's lucky, Portis will emerge as a scoring option for this Bucks team that has fucking no one outside of Giannis. A few spots later, Bespin went with another rook and Colin Murray Boyles. Again, maybe a solid idea for a team that's building for the future, but he's going to be next to irrelevant this season unless all of Toronto's forwards get injured. He has potential, but we're not going to see much of it this year. Along with CMB in the third round, the Rebels collected Yang Hansen at 33, and this is one of my favorite picks of his. There's a lot of hype around this guy, and I don't know how much he's going to play or contribute, but we may see some brilliant flashes. For Eric's situation and deep in the third round, you cannot be upset with this take. The final drafted member of the Rebels comes in the fourth round as Heat rookie, I'm going to butcher the hell out of his name, Kasparis Giakionis finds his way onto Bespin's planet. Much like his brother, Eric is taking the route of all young guys and specifically rookies to analyze who is going to be on his team for the long term. It makes sense, but this draft also isn't going to be very flattering by year's end because I don't think much, if any of these guys, will display an immediate impact. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if all of them averaged under 15 fantasy points. Bobby Portis could sadly wind up being the best player this year, and I'd find it hard to imagine Eric would even be able to get a 4th round pick for him. For the circumstance and first ever draft he's ever done, I don't hate this and I understand why these guys were all selected. They all have potential, but we may not see it realized for years. In the end, it's going to be a bumpy road ahead for Bespin this season. They want to lose, they want to build, they want to discover young talent. That's all great, but it doesn't make the losing that's about to come Eric's way any easier. As long as the freshest Western Conference team is able to prove he's a committed manager and do what he feels is right by his organization, Bespin is going to have a promising future however many years down the line. But if Eric doesn't stick to the plan, this franchise could be in a lot of trouble. Another expansion team last year, another member gone. Matt Prudian was a one and done with the Bikini Bottom Brawlers, a roster he built from scratch and maneuvered through impressive deals and trades as a rookie, creating a vision for the future of his ball club. Unfortunately, he could not return after a short-lived stint, so Mark Solano was brought in as an individual members had been clamoring for. With a passionate spirit and willingness to talk and complete trades early on, there's no doubt in my mind Mark will become one of the most committed staples of our league, but his team as it currently is doesn't have the same potential as the manager himself. Rebranding as the Kyoto Upper Demons, Mark immediately looked to make changes to the 5-14 team, trading for Josh Hart, Russell Westbrook, and Mikal Bridges. The problem is only one of those guys are good, and a bulk of the Demons Mark locked in as keepers aren't too inviting either. I make it clear for every new member in every season, we can't give Mark too much of a hard time when he's only just beginning his expedition into the DBL. Trades, players, drafting, keepers, everything is different or completely new to him. It's a learning process, and we all had to go through it. Add that to the fact this was a brand spanking new team just a year ago, it's a tight spot to be in. Eventually, this roster could have the potential for something more, but the trials and tribulations of being a first-year member mixed with such a young history, it's probably going to be a doomed season. Josh Hart was insane last season, posting over 30 fantasy points per game and being voted in as a starting DBL All-Star. But there's some trepidation with him as Tibbs played him 37 minutes a game and he'll already be turning 31 in March. I like Hart a lot and maybe there's a world in which he improves on his already boisterous stats, but it's more likely we see him drop closer to 25 fantasy points. That's still very good, but a steep decline from last year, which in all honesty was an outlier compared to the rest of his fantasy career. Look, it's possible that Mark got him at a slight discount considering he was so consistently awesome last season, but because Kyoto didn't change the rest of the roster to reflect the fantasy volume that Hart offers, even if it works out for him as a player, this doesn't make much sense laterally for the Demons. So yes, he's a great keeper that I still expect to have a sizable role in New York's game plan, but he is in jeopardy of regressing, and as he climbs into his 30s, I don't have much faith he'll actually increase his production. Deni Avdija is my next favorite keeper of the Demons, and for good reason. Although he started off slow, around the second half of the season in Portland, Avdija was posting 30, 10, and 5 games left and right. His ability to add to all of the major counting stats is incredibly useful, and he may have finally broken through to become that all-star caliber kind of player. I'm still hesitant though, he hasn't found a consistency in the NBA yet, and there are a lot of worthy young guys on the Blazers that could eat into his production. It feels like he's the best of the bunch and that the offense should run through him, but I think we still need to see a full year of consistent play to stamp him as a future great of the Demons franchise. Okongwu comes next as the first year ever being kept, finally breaking through with Capella being shifted to the sidelines. But I'm a wee bit skeptical still. I'm not sure how high his ceiling is, and Porzingis is now joining him in the front court, or possibly really sending Okongwu to the bench, which would put him right back in the predicament he's been in for years with Capella. But he raised his output to 24 fantasy points last season, so if he can still at least hover that range, he will make for a productive young keeper. Moving on to Shaedon Sharpe, I believe this dude has potential, but I'm not certain how much he can improve with this young and dynamic Portland team. Jrue Holiday is in town now, along with Scoot still, and even if Sharpe is an SG, you gotta figure all those guys will mix up their minutes. You've still got Denny and Tumani, and the centers who want their touches as well, so I don't know if there is enough touches to go around to make Sharpe average more than 19 fantasy points. I do like him, but I'm going to be cautious until he shows me he's worth the hype. As far as Kyoto goes, though, I am on board with the young direction and fit of these players together. Obviously, it doesn't mean it's going to equate to success, but as far as a rebuilding entity with youthful talent, I can be talked into many of these guys improving or displaying the ability to be impactful. But when we get to these bottom half of keepers, I am unfortunately not a fan. I love Mikal Bridges as a high-value role player in real life, but he is a 3rd to 4th round pick from a fantasy value frame of mind. He is not a keeper-worthy player, as someone that's averaged 19 fantasy points last season, and he's also 29, so there's not much that is encouraging about his relation with the Demons. I can understand the intrigue with Peyton Pritchard in some capacity, but it grinds my gears to a higher level that in order to get him, Mark gave up some solid draft picks and a borderline all-star type of player. Peyton will have a decent outlook with Tatum out and being confirmed to start, but the reigning 6th man of the year probably won't be eclipsing 21 fantasy points. He'll be a fine addition to any roster that wants to fill out their team, but he's basically a one-year rental unless he blows our minds this season. Anthony Simons will be joining him in Boston, and that signifies to me that it's truly time to stop placing any bets on him. He had his chances in Portland to become an above-average fantasy player, and it never happened. Even with Tatum out, he'll be like a microwave off the bench that doesn't do anything but score. Lastly comes Keontae George, and while I like the idea of him more than Simons, I just lost all excitement about him. He's still young enough to prove something on a bland Jazz roster, but it feels like Collier all but stole that future point guard job from him. Maybe we'll see some improvement, but I doubt Keontae remains with the Demons past November. In the end, Mark is learning the ways of the DBL and what players are worth, so it's all part of the process in designing one's team, especially when you're handed an expansion roster that barely won 5 games last season. I expect 3 to 4 of these guys to be worthwhile fantasy additions, but the rest, not so much. As far as his debut draft, I'd say it's respectable for what he was working with. Mark did not have a first-round pick, which is a cruel way to start your first season when given the keys to an expansion team, but Kyoto's first pick came at number 20 in the 2nd round, Igor Demon. Demon on the Demons. That has the chance to be an absolutely perfect fit. He's projected to start at point guard since Brooklyn has no actual PGs and needs someone to control the tempo outside of fucking Cam Thomas and Michael Porter Jr. He may not be that good, he may never be good at all, but I'm getting hints of something akin to a Josh Giddey rookie campaign. There's a lot of potential there, and being that Mark is young and probably not trying to win, it's a great choice and one of my favorites of the whole draft. Following that up at number 29, the Demons selected TJ McConnell, which I also think is a pretty marvelous pick. Hallie is out, and even in limited minutes, we know he can do some damage. In the past, when he's gotten a full workload, TJ has done some magical things. There's no guarantee he gets a starter's workload or that some of the more tantalizing players on the roster don't consume the missing production of Hallie, but I think this is a safe pick that Mark can use to trade to a contender later in the year. I'm not really a fan of the rest of Mark's picks. Obi Toppin in the 4th round isn't a terrible investment, but at the same time, he was unable to capitalize on fantasy relevance when he was elected to be the starter before Siakam was traded there, so I don't see him being good. And Mitchell Robinson is always injured and not getting a lot of minutes behind Cat, so I mean, listen, even if he starts and Cat is the PF, he's not going to provide much consistency in my opinion. The Demons' last pick in the after draft was Aaron Nesmith, and again, this is the case of some pacer needing to fill the void of Halliburton. Can it be him? Possibly, but Mark already dropped him, and Robinson for that matter, so it doesn't matter to Kyoto. This draft is not terrible on paper, and I really like the first 2 picks, but these selections are def not helping Mark win games this year, and I don't know if that's his game plan. Overall, Mark is not going to be good this year, and that's evident when you take on a team that's only been a franchise for one season. On top of that, I'm not sure what his mindset is going into this campaign. It feels and appears as if he wants to be competitive or attempt to win games, evidenced by his trade for Jared Allen, but outside of Allen and potentially Josh Hart, there's not going to be too many super consistent contributors to get him to the playoffs. The genetic makeup of this team is mostly weak and not strong enough to make an impact, and as Mark navigates his way through the league, mistakes will be made that will set him back too. He's down a handful of valuable draft picks after trading for Hart and Allen, and that's going to hurt him in the long run, while also hurting this year since I can't see a way he wins over 5 games. He'll be much better than the Rebels, but at least it's visible to outsiders that Eric is tanking and has a strategy. I'm not sure what Mark's is, and until he decides what he wants that to be, the Demons could be in limbo this year and for the foreseeable future. After winning 4 total games the past 2 years, the McLovins are certainly on the road to recovery, but it's still going to be a bumpy street with a lot of potholes and accidents waiting to occur. By stacking up draft picks and mouth-watering compensation over the next several years, as well as owning the first 4 out of 5 picks in this year's draft, Josh has set the McLovins up for a pretty exceptional future. As great as that sounds, Maryland is still going to be in for it for the 25-26 season until we figure out who is actually going to come alive and elevate this team to new heights. Looking at Josh's keepers, I would say they once again aren't really turning any heads, but the potential is still there for many, if not all of them. Amen Thompson is the clear cornerstone. I expect him to average 28 to 30 fantasy points after breaking out to the tune of 26 last season. Even with KD in town, he should only be getting better in his 3rd season. My second favorite keeper in Maryland might come as a surprise in Donovan Clingan. He didn't do much in his rookie year, but Maryland invested in him, and he impressed when he got big minutes. I'm thinking there could be a huge jump with Ayton gone, resulting in 24 to 25 fantasy points. As for Brandon Miller, we saw a little increase last year too, but he missed about half the year due to injury, and is always stunted by the fact that he plays in Charlotte, and they have no idea what they're doing. I don't know what Miles Bridges, LaMelo, and Con Knipple do to his fantasy output, but he looks as if he will begin to break out as the main offensive threat since LaMelo can't stay healthy. Stephon Castle won the Rookie of the Year and displayed a confidence and scoring ability that proves he could be a substantial player for the future, but for this season it's hard to buy into. You've got De'Aaron Fox healthy, and on top of that, 2nd overall pick Dylan Harper splitting minutes with them in the backcourt. Not to mention Devin Vassell still exists, and Wemby is obviously going to get a bulk of the touches too. I like Castle long term, but I don't know how impactful he actually is in 2026. Sarr should develop though and improve as the starter in Washington for the 2nd straight year. I'm not in love with him yet, but he could mirror a Jaren Jackson Jr. archetype, except maybe even be a better rebounder. It remains to be seen, but he should get close to 20 fantasy points this season. Amen's brother is not as good, but Ausar also is slowly improving. His defensive talent is no question, but his offense and counting stats are still coming along. I think we see him approach 20 to 21 fantasy points after the 17 he put up last year, which doesn't make him undroppable or anything, but it's nice to know that if he reaches that mark, he is continuously progressing. Lively actually concerns me. Josh traded for him last year around the deadline after Anthony Davis was a Maverick, and while he's young and can become a productive center, what is the likelihood with AD dominating the paint and Gafford continuing to be a useful player? As a young team that's still rebuilding, it isn't a terrible investment, but it still doesn't make much sense in the grand scheme of things. Rounding out the last of Maryland's keepers is Jaden Ivey, who is sort of in a make or break year. He hasn't done much yet, and although he was starting to come along last season, he broke his leg and missed half the campaign. Who knows what he'll look like coming back, and if he finally takes that leap to be a secondary star alongside Cade, but if he doesn't, it's going to be the nail in the coffin with his McLovins career. Overall, I expect most of these guys to improve in some regard as Maryland continues to feel out their players and build their core. It's still not going to be enough to make the playoffs or win many games, but if you're a McLovins fan, it's time to finally get excited about what's to come. Another year, another draft where Josh collects an assortment of rookies. Except this year, it may all finally come together as Maryland had 4 of the first 5 picks in the draft, including number 1 overall pick, Cooper Flagg. We know Flagg is going to be a great player, the question is just how great. Josh went on record to tell me he wouldn't trade Cooper for Luka. The murmurings of generational talent go around a little too much these days, and I don't think Coop will be a guy averaging north of 36 fantasy points regularly, but hey, maybe he will. I understand Luka's older, but come on, he's 26. Anyway, I understand it to some extent, and I presume Flagg will put up somewhere from 22 to 25 fantasy points in his rookie year. Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, and Trey Johnson filled out the rest of Josh's first round, and there is mouth-watering upside for all of them. As is always the case, don't know how much of that is really going to be seen in this upcoming year, but at least Ace and Trey will likely get good workloads in their situations. Bailey's attitude is a little concerning, and being on the Wizards is always scary for anyone, but I think these two should have solid rookie years. As a VJ owner, you're going to have to hope for injuries to the Sixers, which is likely with Embiid and Paul George being focal points of the offense, but VJ is probably the starting shooting guard regardless. When McCain is healthy, and even Grimes being there, it's possible his playtime isn't as consistent, but he has a lot of potential, and he brings that to a team with playoff hope. The final pick of the McLovins draft was Zero Fears Jeremiah, who I'm not super high on, only because he's on the Pelicans and their medical staff is actual garbage. I also don't know how much playtime he'd be getting, but I guess with all the injuries always happening there, it's possible he receives a lot of run. For a 5th round pick and sticking to the theme of the youth movement, the choice can't be hated on at all. Overall, this is the draft Josh has been waiting for, and Cooper Flagg alone gives him the chance at taking home his first ever Best Draft award. I may have liked to see Josh take Jimmy Butler or something, only because we know Maryland's going to have some tough-ass decisions down the line when we talk about keepers, and Jimmy could have gone for a first rounder or something to a contender. But I get it, this was what the McLovins have been building towards, and they had the most promising rookies at their disposal. To summarize my thoughts, the McLovins will yet again be bad, but there will be a pretty stark contrast between this year and last. Improvements will be made, and alpha dogs will appear as the leaders of this team with the likes of Flagg, Amen, and whoever else steps up to the plate. It's just that my only gripe is that he can't keep all of these guys, so it's going to be time for Josh to really start thinking about the next phase of this organization. You can't rebuild forever, and this should be Maryland's kind of final season working out the kinks before aiming to make the playoffs next year. It's an exciting time to be a McLovins fan, and I can't wait to see what they do. In 9th place this season will be none other than the Los Angeles Stars led by GM Gary. After an impressive finals run and second consecutive playoff appearance, LA took a step back in 2025 when they missed the postseason entirely. This was due to a handful of reasons, most notably a Joel Embiid-sized injury, along with a multitude of others missing time. Through the tumultuous stretch of it all, Gary signified a rebuild was on the way, but the offseason made it seem like there was only a slight retooling in order. With all the other competition in the league and many teams comprised of stronger elements, it's hard to imagine a universe in which the Stars bounce back from last year's disappointment and make the playoffs again. The reason they improved so vastly from an all-dumbass lottery squad to a dominant finals team in the first place was because of a ton of players that they currently don't possess. Joel Embiid, Kawhi Leonard, Jaylen Brown, Darius Garland, and Miles Turner. I'm not saying Gary didn't do the right thing by moving on from them, but the answer to the question of what do the Stars do now is still up in the air. On paper, the Stars' 7th-year keepers look rather sturdy, but I'm just not a firm believer in this unit taking them to the next level. Brunson has become their best player, which is awesome, but I also don't think he should be the best player on any DBL team. Maybe it's in the cards that he continues to slightly elevate to the point he's averaging nearly 30 fantasy points, but I think the 26.8 he put up last year is about in line with the best he has to offer. Which is good, but he should not be the best player on the team. If he's not, it's Booker who puts up pretty identical fantasy numbers. We've seen Book be better, we've seen him be worse, but this is pretty much who he is now. A 25 to 27 fantasy point guy that has his amazing games, but will never truly be a tier 1 fantasy option. This is a good duo, but I wish they were the 3rd and 4th best players of the lineup, not the 1st and 2nd. Next up, we have DeAndre Ayton, and it's like, this guy literally got bought out for being so lazy and such a headache. The 1st overall pick in 2018 who puts in no effort and doesn't seem to give a shit about his game. That being said, he still averaged 25 fantasy points in a down season, which demonstrates there's still some kind of hope left for the big fella, and playing with Luka and LeBron in the bright lights of LA might actually motivate him to be the best version of himself, but it's still valid to be concerned, and if not for his determination, for the fact that he usually misses a chunk of games every year. I'm going to predict 26 to 27 fantasy points, but he's a bit of an enigma and can go either way. John Collins is someone I'm not the biggest fan of because he has had a bit of a roller coaster performance in the DBL, going from looking like a future stud to being just okay to bad and everything in between before being traded to Utah and randomly averaging 25 fantasy points. He was a welcome surprise, but he was putting up numbers on a very bad team. When you slot him into the Clippers rotation with all their mouths to feed and more serious attempts at winning basketball, I don't think he repeats this sort of one-off season. Expect closer to 22 fantasy points. You want to get excited about Porzingis Porzingis in a new environment again too, but it's extremely difficult to when you factor in his lengthy injury history. Even if he suits up a majority of the schedule, which I wouldn't hold my breath for, he's playing with a handful of fantasy relevant guys that could take boards, points, and all kinds of stats away from him. I think he's unfortunately going to continue to lethargically decline and will probably average like 24 fantasy points. In the offseason, Gary welcomed in Isaiah Hartenstein as a new keeper, and while iHart was pretty spectacular last go-round, he unfortunately decreased dramatically with Chet back in the lineup. I don't know what exactly he's going to average or how many games Chet will play, but if they're both healthy, Hartenstein will lose minutes and rebound opportunities. For the price Gary paid, it wasn't that much, so it's a solid little pickup for LA, but I'm not really sure it'll be worth it either, especially if this is a team that's eyeing to blow it up sooner rather than later. One player that I have never been as high on in fantasy as others is Jamal Murray, who, truth be told, has been rather consistent and nifty the past 2 years. In 2024, he put up a career-high 25 fantasy points a night, and last year 23, which isn't as impressive, but it's still better than what I recall for a majority of his DBL days. I'm just not quite a fan still because he's known to be in and out of the lineup, and since he's reverted back to 23, that seems like more of the example of who he is and not the outlier year of dropping nearly 26 a night. As your 7th keeper and staple of the Stars, it's pretty good, but I'd be wanting to move off of him ASAP if a rebuild is in sight. The final keeper elected to be a star is Toumani Camara, a young gun that averaged only 17 fantasy points last year, but began to break out once January rolled around. Although I think he'll be pretty clearly the worst player for this squadron this season based on fantasy point value, it's definitely within reason to believe that he could put up 21 to 22 fantasy points. I like this fit a lot for the Stars, being a young guy that he only had to pay a 4th round pick for and seems to be a major component of Portland's future that already made an all-defense team. If the rebuild does indeed happen, it's going to be nice to have a guy like Camara when all else seems hopeless. Overall, from a contributing standpoint in a fantasy game, all of these keepers are worthwhile additions to any DBL group. Toumani may still not fully excel to what he could become, injury-riddled headaches may damper the mood with guys like Porzingis, Ayton, and Murray, and the leaders of the team being guards that average under 27 fantasy points is probably not what you want, but they are all good players. Their fit together raises other questions like, are the Stars going to execute this rebuild or are they going to try to compete? But in my opinion, it'd probably be a bad idea to aim for the playoffs or focus on winning a chip when they couldn't even do it with a prime Embiid, Jaylen Brown, and Kawhi. The reset button is very close to being pushed, but maybe LA's draft will have me thinking otherwise. It doesn't. Well, listen, I don't think this is a bad draft or anything, but this board is not going to push the needle for the Stars to get back into the postseason. At number 7, Gary took Jalen Green, which to me is honestly shocking. The guy kind of sucked ass as the quote-unquote first option in Houston for several years, and now he's the secondary quote-unquote star to Devin Booker. He's not efficient, he doesn't fill up the stat sheet, and he only ever seems to flash potential in the last 2 months of the season. Can a new environment make him a better player? Possibly, but he's never averaged 20 fantasy points, and now he's supposed to do that in an awkward fit with Phoenix? I doubt it. Christian Brown played better than Jalen ever did last season. Miles Bridges was available. Hell, I'd rather take a chance on Paul George getting hurt than getting burnt by Jalen Green again. I'm a little harsher on this because I truthfully gave up on Jalen a few seasons ago, but I still think there were better options available. Also, Gary traded his 2028 first and a 2nd round pick for this pick. For Jalen Green? At 18, Gary went with Cam Thomas, and this is likely his best pick in my eyes. Cam Thomas has had a polarizing career thus far, but the Nets absolutely suck and need a scorer. That is Cam Thomas, and whether he does that to the tune of 22 fantasy points or only 19, it was a good idea to roll with him here. He's also still only 24, so maybe he actually puts it all together, but at the very least, he should have a fine, if unremarkable, season with the Nets. Tari Eason and Derek Queen were next in the 3rd round, and I also think these were pretty smart choices. Eason is probably not going to be starting, but we know what he's capable of when given minutes. Jalen and Dylan might be out of H-Town, but KD and DFS are also new additions that take up playtime, so I'm not sure how impactful he can be, but he still averaged 19 fantasy points last year in only 25 minutes. Queen is going to miss some time to begin the year, but can very quickly become the starting center for this uneventful Pelicans squad. Don't know yet because he's just a rookie, but I do like this pick quite a bit, especially for the 3rd round. Lastly comes Pods, the 46th pick of the draft, and this is a lot better than 3rd overall. I'm skeptical after a disappointing turn last year, but he's still young and can definitely make some sort of sleeper impact. Jimmy being there probably helps his game and efficiency to some degree too. Now that I've analyzed this draft out loud, it sounds like a pretty damn good one, all things considered. We should expect that from the two-time best draft winner, but at the same time, I still stand on the fact that this is not going to do anything for redemption at making the playoffs. Tari is a question mark, Derek Queen is injured and is a question mark, Pods is still a question mark, and Jalen Green is probably going to be his usual 18 to 19 fantasy point self again. Cam Thomas having the best prospects doesn't scream this is a postseason team to me. Despite me liking these general selections, it comes down to Gary implementing a vision for the Stars and sticking to it. Very rarely can you get the best of both worlds in fantasy. This is not a rebuilding team as constructed, but it's not a competitive roster either. I think LA is going to have to blow it up and start from scratch because Jalen Green cannot be the answer to anyone's problems. In 8th place might come as a stunning choice, but I actually have the Peach Creek Oofmagoos landing in this spot. Look, their finals run last year was remarkable, and I think Gio has low-key become one of the better managers in the association, but it was really only a matter of time before all of the injury-riddled players the Magoos employed all crossed paths in the hospital at the same time. The 2023 All-Fantasy member has an uphill battle to make the playoffs for a third consecutive season as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, Tatum being out all year is a critical hit to the Magoos since he's the captain and best player on the squad, but he's only just creeping in on his prime, so I wouldn't worry if I was Gio. For this season, though, I'd probably fucking panic. At least Cade officially broke out last year, becoming one of the best point guards in the league and being elected as a starting DBL All-Star by voting members. He racked up 32 fantasy points per game and is only getting started still at 24 years old. I'm still slightly putting his dominance on pause, only because most of his career saw him pretty banged up and out of the lineup, and we need to see him repeat this kind of mesmerizing season before we label him as one of the DBL's very best, but just another notch under his belt will make that statement come true. AD on the Mavericks could be a scary sight. For multiple reasons. He might be the best we've seen him since he was on the Pelicans, but getting another year older means there's just more possibility for him to get injured and sit out. When playing, I expect a baseline of 40 fantasy points per game, but I'm always going to be nervous with him, especially since his Dallas tenure began with 9 games played. KD has also joined a new team for the 7th fantasy season, and while I do believe he's going to dip to around 28 or 27 fantasy points, that's still pretty amazing for a guy that just turned 37 and is playing next to Sengun and Amen Thompson. I do think he's going to start taking a bit of a backseat at this stage of his career, but he's still going to be effortlessly special. I just also stay cautious about his games played since that's been a recurring issue for him too. Speaking of injuries, let's welcome in LaMelo Ball and Joel Embiid. Oops, as they walk through the door, I just learned they'll miss several weeks. Listen, I don't want to give them shit for being injured. As a guy that tore his ACL and wasn't able to ever get it right, I understand the pain that it brings. But sensibly, in the DBL, I have no faith in them to play more than 40 games each. LaMelo has only had one real healthy year, and the murmurs that Embiid's career is over are harrowing, to say the least. If they can actually suit up and play at full strength, these two are some of the best in the league, but that remains to be seen. And even LaMelo declined to 25 fantasy points when we had been anticipating more from him over the years. Then we have ourselves the Raptors duo that haven't played a game together yet in Brandon Ingram and RJ Barrett. I am not really moved by either of these guys, and the fact that they play on the same team now kind of makes things even worse. Barrett had his best professional campaign by far, averaging nearly 23 fantasy points, but he only played 58 games. Add in BI, a healthy Quickly, improving Grady Dick, and beloved prospect Colin Murray Boyles, his numbers give the impression they're gonna decrease. It's even worse for Ingram, who's in the same predicament but is even less healthy. We already know he was the second option to Zion, so it's not like the change of scenery is going to make him better than Scotty, so I'm not very optimistic about either of these dudes' production this season. Where he had room to operate as the main player on the Pelicans with Zion constantly out, now he's going to be giving that up with all the mouths to feed around him. I want to love these keepers, but at every turn I see something I don't like. This year alone, having Tatum sidelined for all 82 games is terrible news for Peach Creek. Then we're talking about employing other insanely injury-prone players. Embiid, AD, LaMelo, Ingram, and KD are all known to miss significant time. RJ isn't going to be anything spectacular, and Ingram is also set to decline. Cade is the last guy left, who is awesome, but again, let's see him repeat this, and let's also not forget that before last year, he couldn't really stay healthy on the court either. As usual, on paper, this squadron is deadly, but if they fall apart due to injuries, the Peach Creek infrastructure will collapse next. Kicking off their draft, the Magoos elected to roll with Naz Reid at number 17. I don't really like this pick. He's not bad. He averaged 19 fantasy points last year. It's possible he can build on that, and getting a guy that averages 19 isn't the worst to have on your roster either, but I just feel like there were a handful of stronger assets to choose from, whether they're more established players or guys with potential to improve. He should be a fine player at the end of Peach Creek's bench, but it's not a sexy name to me. In the third round comes Norm Powell, and again, not in love with this. He surprised many last year, but dropped pretty significantly in the second half of the season to only average 19. The Heat also don't have many go-to guys right now, and with Hero out, he could once again have a hot beginning to the campaign, but I don't think that he's going to regularly be consistent. In the fourth round, Gio went with Keegan Murray and Jared McCain. Keegs in the fourth is definitely better than being a keeper at this point anymore, but it's hard to believe in him really progressing as far as this Sacramento team is constructed. He's the fourth option at best, and he only averaged 18. He's still young, but not a big fan of the pick. Jared McCain was unfortunately already ruled out the first couple weeks of the year. He's also got to compete with Edgecombe and all those guards too, so he may not be very good. All we have is a small sample size from last year. I like this pick. It's actually kind of my favorite of his board because I like the upside, but there's a good chance McCain's fantasy talents aren't very fruitful this season. Gio had two more picks after this because of guys in his IR, and first he went with what I thought was sort of a steal in the fifth round, Fred VanVleet. But it was the first year we drafted in September, and Gio got fucked because of FVV tearing his ACL 2 days later and McCain's thumb injury too. Obviously, this is an unfortunate wasted pick now, but I think it would have been a great look at this point of the draft. Lastly comes Keyshawn George, and I don't know how I feel. I like Bub Carrington. I thought he was the clear standout between the two last season, so I'm surprised because George was the one that Gio took instead of Bub Carrington. I don't think he's going to be starting or how much playtime in general is really expected, but as a late round flyer, who knows? The potential is there, but I don't necessarily believe it's going to be close to realized in 2026. At the end of the day, I think this is sadly a pretty weak draft altogether. FVV getting hurt really screws the board up because I'm not sure there's a surefire fantasy vet or contributor out of any of them. McCain has upside and can make some noise as early as this year, but he's already injured too. This isn't a god-awful draft or anything, but I think Peach Creek could have done a lot better. To wrap up my thoughts, I really don't see them being in the postseason again. This draft needed to be perfect, and I'd still be on the fence about it. There's just way too many injury-prone players and question marks surrounding a bulk of the roster. Gio has come into some draft capital to push for some big trades and adjustments to the team, but I don't think it'd be worth that scramble of getting better just to maybe be a fringe playoff squad. I could be totally wrong though. This team literally was in the finals last year, and Gio seems to improve as a manager every day, so you have to respect them. But at the same time, the Magoos are now playing in Tier A with the best of the best, so more losses are likely to come on top of an already suspicious year. The last team to miss the playoffs in my approximation will unfortunately be the Napa Valley Fighting Grapes as Mike prepares for his third season in the DBL. Mike has been a solid team since entering the league, finishing in 5th the past 2 years and deploying the greatest fantasy player we've ever seen in Nikola Jokic, but the team has never really taken off and seems to be stuck in limbo of sorts as a postseason crew that doesn't really have enough in the tank to win it all. There's a handful of other great guys on this roster, but I think this is going to be the year we see Napa Valley in the lottery, which could possibly cause Mike to opt out of contention and put Jokic on the trade block. Yes, I know I said possibly, but I've been recording for a while and I don't really feel like redoing it, even though it's not that hard to redo it, but I'm not going to. Anyway, Jokic doesn't need any introduction. He will continue to average somewhere in the vicinity of 50 fantasy points. I've been saying the same thing about Vucevic for about the last 4 years, but he's 35 this season, so you have to imagine some sort of statistical decline. The Bulls seem to be finally going young, and he doesn't fit those plans. For now, he's given us no reason to think he's going to drop off, consistently putting up 28 to 30 fantasy points over this immaculate stretch, but maybe even a small decrease is in order for something like 14 and 9 and 26 fantasy points. Fox is a little bit of a worry for me personally. I was never insanely high on him in the DBL because he never shot past that 26 fantasy point range I want to label someone as an elite player, but that doesn't mean he's bad at all. However, officially going from the first option in Sacramento to the second option in San Antonio, as well as sharing the backcourt with the Rookie of the Year and the second overall pick, I think it's feasible to expect a 24 fantasy point year out of him, which is good enough production, but maybe not what we have always clamored for out of Fox. Franz should continue to improve as he has steadily increased his numbers ever so slightly every year. He averaged 25 last year and he's still only 24. If he can remain healthy, he's going to be a lethal 1B next to Paolo with a possible outcome of 26 to 27 fantasy points. D. Mitch wildly fell off in Season 6, going from nearly 30 fantasy points to 24. That Cavs offense and sharing the ball equally certainly knocked his numbers down, and I don't see why he would randomly shoot up back past 25. He's still a worthy addition to any team, but expectations should be managed. Julius Randle dramatically declined 2 to 23 fantasy points on the Wolves, and again, while that's not bad, he's not shooting back up to that 28 fantasy point range when he was an all-DBL player. I'd expect a similar season from Juju. Aside from one obscure all-DBL 27 fantasy point average season from Miles Turner, he's been off my radar completely. He usually gets injured and otherwise is only good for about 22 fantasy points. Mike didn't give up much for him at all, and the move to the Bucks may increase his boards and scoring, but being next to Giannis, maybe it'll go down. He's not a great fantasy player, but he could be reliable for the season at least. We'll see how it pans out, but I'd personally rather Mike have kept someone else at this point. Lastly is Coby White, and I don't know what it is, but I just can't get excited about him. I know he had a pretty stellar end to the year, but he did the season before as well, and if I'm not mistaken, the year before that too. Sounds a little too Jalen Greeny for me. With LaVine, DeRozan, and Lonzo out of the picture, maybe he can average 22 plus fantasy points, but I've been waiting on a legit breakout from him since the Tropics kept him back in 2020. This could finally be a version of that, but I'm still skeptical until he proves it for a full campaign. In the end, I think this is slightly a weak group of keepers. Jokic really elevates them, and they're still comprised of talented players such as Vooch, Franz, Fox, and Spida, but they're not entirely exciting or expected to be evolutionary for the Grapes. There's a chance this core performs better than I anticipate, but it's tough to line this up with the top half of keepers in the league and say they're on the same level. Unfortunately, I feel as if Mike only made things worse when examining his draft. He had 2 picks in the first round and elected to go with Scoot Henderson and Reed Sheppard. Before I tackle the Sheppard debacle, Scoot at number 8 is wildly high. Scoot has played 2 NBA seasons, last year marginally improving to 16 fantasy points. Even if there's a chance he were to slightly raise his average again, he is not someone to be picked in the first round until he can prove it. At best, late second round, but even then, Scoot has pretty much been nothing but bad so far in his career, and on top of that, I can't imagine he's even starting with Jrue Holiday and Shaedon Sharpe seemingly being preferred. Then who even knows once Lillard comes back next season, but Scoot should have been a 4th round pick in my approximation, and even then, it seems like Mike is a contender or team that's at least trying to be, so if Scoot manages to increase his fantasy average to 18, that's not going to do too much, and I highly doubt he will. To make matters even worse, he's going to miss nearly 2 months to start the year. Mike didn't know that, and that's why I like to draft in October, but I really don't think that this was the way to go. The potential is still in there, but it's fading away every day, and not as long as he's a Blazer either. Now on to Reed Sheppard. This was actually worse than the Scoot selection until FVV got hurt. Before the injury, it just makes no sense to me. He was not starting over a proven vet who makes $40 million a year on a team that has championship aspirations. I would say again, not even until the 4th round, really should he have even been considered. But now that Freddie's out of the picture, Sheppard has a chance to show what he can do. I still don't know that he starts, and even if he does, he played virtually 0 basketball last season, so I can't imagine he comes out and averages 19 fantasy points. Can he be good for the long term? Possibly, yeah, but I still wouldn't really trust him to be a consistent or impactful player this year. FVV getting hurt really saved this pick, but I still think he's going to be a bit of a roller coaster project. In the 2nd round comes probably Mike's best pick in Cam Johnson. That's not saying much in my opinion. Cam Johnson averaged 20 fantasy points in Brooklyn as essentially the lone option. Now he's the 4th option in Denver, so that doesn't bode well, although he'll be much more efficient and Jokic will instantly upgrade his shots and overall play. I'm going to say something similar though, around 19 fantasy points, which I'm not in love with but is passable enough for the 2nd round. Mike was off the clock until the 5th round where the Grapes selected Bona and Coulibaly. Coulibaly was already dropped, which I think was a bit of a mistake. He flashed some potential, and for a 5th round pick with no clear focal point in sight for the Wizards, I think he can be a quality end-of-bench guy. Mike still has Bona though, but I think it's going to be very hard for him to penetrate with such a girthy front court. Cock. I like the guy, and Embiid will obviously be missing time, so it's a decent flyer, but there's going to be some major inconsistency there. In the end, if I was to bet on Napa Valley making the playoffs, I'd say it's not happening. The team is already kind of shallow and not as threatening as some of the more prestigious squads in the DBL, and the draft put the Grapes in a downwards trajectory instead of lifting them up. Mike generally doesn't make many trades over the course of the season, which is not always a bad thing, but this team is going to need some change to fill in the gaps and be able to compete with the best of them. It's still possible they end up in the postseason again, but that would likely mean a third consecutive first-round exit as the roster feels stagnant and uninspired. Jokic as the centerpiece of your team will always propel you into conversations about going the distance and being competitive, but based on the last 2 seasons and most of these players' outlooks, I think we see Napa Valley miss the playoffs for the first time. The final new member of the DBL's storied league sees Ed of the currently nameless franchise making the playoffs in 6th place as he fills in for Gian of Magic City Mad Hatters fame. Gian made waves before exiting the DBL, trading away LeBron, Curry, Gobert, Jimmy, and multiple first-rounders for the young star power of Evan Mobley and Ja Morant. It was a controversial and questionable couple of moves that basically resulted in Gian departing from Delta Beta Lambda, leaving his franchise with 0 first-round picks and no sound core intact. Thankfully, Ed was gracious enough to take on the challenge of inheriting his ball club, and in doing so, made a bit of a splash himself with another insane trade, sending NBA MVP SGA to the reigning champs in exchange for Ivica Zubac, Steph Curry, Rudy Gobert, Jimmy Butler, and Kawhi Leonard. So basically, he just got the players back that couldn't get Gian to the playoffs, and no first-rounders to go along with it. You can't blame Ed so much, especially since he's still getting his feet wet and trying to adjust to the lay of the land, but on paper, he now has a legitimate 8 guys in his corner to compete with. It's just that in my opinion, they're not as deadly as they theoretically sound, and we already know this core with SGA was not imposing enough to reach the playoffs. I was never as disgusted by Gian's trade for the youngsters last year, even if I was still dumbfounded by it. There's still credit to be given for the fact that the league voted in Mobley as an all-star and he continues to increase his fantasy numbers bit by bit. He could reach 31 fantasy points this season, and at only 24 years old, still has room to grow and keep this up for a long time. Zubac was the surprise of the season in year 6, averaging an unprecedented 33 fantasy points and securing all DBL second team honors. There's reason to believe that this was a bit of a fluke as it came kind of out of nowhere in his age 28 season, and with the Clippers loading up their depth, I foresee a world in which he drops below 30 fantasy points, but he's still going to be an excellent upper echelon keeper that should make his second straight All-Star game. Ja Morant has kind of been written off. He can't stay healthy, and last year we saw him fall below what we all expect of him, averaging only 25 fantasy points. That's not horrendous or anything, but considering he's never in the lineup and he used to average 30, it's a pretty big letdown. With Bane out of Memphis and Taylor Jenkins fired, however, I think Ja will be bouncing back closer to what we know he is capable of, but I'm still worried he only plays 50 to 60 games this year, which is always going to sting. Gobert unfortunately came back down to earth as well, dropping from a shocking 32 a game to 27, and most of last year's campaign saw him around the 24 fantasy point mark. He's a strange player to get a read on now, and he's only getting deeper into his 30s, so I'm not very high on him, but I think he still does average like 25 to 26, which will be fruitful enough to be happy with. As always, Curry is the greatest shooter God ever created, but he put up 26 fantasy points, which is obviously still nice, but he's going to turn 38, and a full year of Butler may continue to eat at his value. Not to mention, he usually misses a handful of stretches throughout the season, so he's not quite as good as people usually predict in our fantasy format. I would not be surprised if he dropped to 24 fantasy points this year, but even if he's at 26 and up again, you gotta wonder when he's going to hang him up. Next comes the 2 white boys, starting with the all-star in Miami, Tyler Herro. We've literally been waiting since the first season in the DBL for Herro to unlock that next level of play, and it looks like it finally arrived to the tune of 25 fantasy points. Plus, he played a whopping 77 games, which is good for anyone, but Tyler's been known to miss time, so this is hugely encouraging. Is he a one-time NBA all-star, or is he going to continue this kind of play? We'll see, but you have to be happy to make him a keeper for the first time in the history of the DBL. As for Reeves, it's an interesting case because when last year started, the hype was beginning to die down as AR-15 did not seem to be matching the expectations people put on him to be a must-roster fantasy player. After a month or two of inconsistent play, Reeves sparked something inside him to become absolutely sensational. I mean, he still only finished the year at 24 fantasy points per game, but you gotta remember he was doing this next to LeBron and Luka. I'm not really sure he's gonna get much better than that, and I don't agree with him being kept over Jimmy Butler considering most of Team Ed are old veterans, but it's worth seeing seeing if Reeves can continue to excel. He's not super young, he's 27 years old, so this could certainly be where he maxes out, but it's still exciting that he took a nice jump last campaign. Last and honestly least comes Kawhi, who's in an even worse situation than when he was just load managing and always getting hurt. Now he's got this whole investigation looming over his head about the workaround with his contract, so I have no clue what that could mean, but as far as Kawhi's fantasy performance, he's gonna have his moments of absolutely stellar play, but it's never going to be enough to me to justify the missed time and slow rise in production. He's starting this year healthy, which means he's going to get hurt at some point instead of begin the season on the sidelines. I mean, he's 34 years old now, so it could only get worse for Sugar K, and if he's suspended or has his contract voided with the Clippers, it's going to be a catastrophic failure. Overall, these keepers are good, all things considered. I don't like Kawhi for the headache he brings, and there are a few regression candidates as well as guys that have probably hit their ceiling in play, such as Hero and Reeves, but it's a respectable dynamic of keepers. I just don't know how much stronger this unit is compared to the rest of the league. On paper, they're pretty lethal, but peeling back the layers helps us identify them as a lot less dangerous than at first glance. The Eds did not pick in the draft until the third round because Gian blew up his future, but the selections Ed made were actually very impressive. Kevin Porter Jr. is projected to start for an unceremonious Bucks team, and even though he loves to beat women, he may be north of 20 fantasy points since we know what he is capable of when given the rock. But we also know what he's capable of when given alone time with a woman. But Ed also took OG Anunoby, and I'm surprised he fell this far. I'm not the hugest fan of OG, he's usually injury prone and never really wows with his fantasy numbers, but he averaged a more than respectable 21 fantasy points and played in a whopping 74 games last year. That's never going to happen again, but to be that good and slip to the third round is surprising, so good on Ed for snagging him. In the fourth round, Andrew Wiggins is also a good pick. I don't love him, but 19 fantasy points a game is good for this spot, and maybe he'll hit 20 on a Heat team that could use the scoring punch. He could dwindle in production too, but I don't really mind this pick at all. In the fifth round, Ed rolled with Kaman Malak, rookie Sun center, and I think it's worth the gamble. We know Mark Williams will always get hurt, and he'll still have to compete with Nick Richards, but I'd imagine he wins the coaching staff over more than the guy who never seems to crack 20 minutes a game. But obviously, he's a project that is not guaranteed minutes. Finally, with the absolute last pick in the draft, Eddie's excellent team chose CJ McCollum. Listen, he'll never be a Knight again, and I don't like that he's on the Wizards of all places where they have a lot of young talent too, and I feel like he'll mainly be there to mentor, but I think he deserved to go a little higher than this. Maybe I scared people away by saying how much I hated him, but he averaged 19 again last season, which is more than a lot of people that went in the first and second round. I assume that'll drop slightly, but still, maybe it goes up because there's no one else that's actually good in Washington. At the end of the day, this is low-key one of the best drafts in the league. It's not super flashy or full of hot names, but Ed grabbed guys in great places and doesn't legitimately have a bad pick in my opinion. Some of them will be unspectacular, but you can't tell me any of these choices were flat-out stupid decisions. This draft will certainly help Ed in fighting for a playoff spot, something Gian couldn't do with what was probably a better team the last 2 seasons. He'll have to avoid injuries and make some trades to beefen up the roster if he really wants to compete, but I think it's pretty likely we see this roster in some first round action. Not to mention, he's in the C tier of the DBL Cup, meaning he's going to be playing the worst teams the most, giving him a presumable chance to finish even higher. Moving forward, adjustments will have to be made, but this season, I think the new Edward Eddies, led by Ed, will be the 6th seed by the end of the year. They just won't have a team name. After three-peating from 2022 to 2024 and finishing as the MVP and team with the best record last season, the Knights shocked the world by trading away 2 stars in Jaylen Brown and Pascal Siakam, who were poised to have potentially the best seasons of their career, with their co-leads being out with Achilles tears for the year. In exchange, Joe got back one of those players who was ruled out for the entire schedule, Tyrese Haliburton, which obviously throws a little bit of a wrench in the plans of New Jersey if they planned on contending. Most probably agreed with that trade, however, but things really took a turn when the Knights traded for Cam Whitmore and actually kept him going into year 7. With Jared Allen also sent packing, this current Knights team barely resembles the first ever dynasty that was born out of the DBL, aside from Luka, Sabonis, and DeRozan. Many might consider this a peculiar fumble from the Knights and the organization, but as the biased president of the league, I am fully on board with New Jersey's game plan here. I think it's safe to say it would take a miracle to defeat the Tropics this year, who have only gotten better over the offseason, and I personally felt like despite how elite the Knights still were as arguably the best team in Season 6, the cracks were certainly starting to form and showcase signs to come for a possible deterioration of the team in the future. Ja Morant, an NJ legend, traded away after diminishing returns and nagging injuries. Donovan Mitchell came back down to earth and no longer displayed what the Knights signed up for. Nick Claxton completely disappeared as a fantasy relevant player, and I shit you not, every single keeper from last year decreased their fantasy average. Some by a lot, some by a few, but every one of them did, which had me worrying. We're on the decline a little bit. Despite what we were able to accomplish last year with a lot of injuries and a lot of reduced production, we were shown that it's not going to last forever. LeBron is one of my best players. He is 41. DeRozan is 36 and dropped 4 fantasy points last season. I decided to make the tough decision to go into this season with a soft rebuild mindset, a retooling, if you will. It's the perfect season to do so, in my opinion, with Hallie out and the Tropics looking unbeatable. Let me take a step back to eventually take 3 steps forward. This could be a terrible decision, but I wanted to get ahead of the problems the team was showing before they are unfixable. Retool so you aren't forced into a rebuild. And I still think we're going to be a competitive playoff team. The Knights still have 2 top 5 DBL players, LeBron James, 13 first rounders, and a 4-time GM of the year leading the charge. I'd be shocked if NJ were to miss the playoffs. Luka had a down season last year, averaging 35.5 fantasy points, which would be enough to make any other player in the league untouchable, but it was a disappointing turn for the Slovenian superstar. However, you have to remember, he was injured most of the campaign, and then had to adjust to playing in LA with LeBron while being devastated that he got betrayed by Dallas. We've heard about the revenge tour, which might even be crazier than the one I'm having on my ex right now. Luka looking slim and motivated, I expect him to finish with over 40 fantasy points a game again. Sabonis should also have another amazing year. With no Fox for the whole season, the team might even run more offense through his hands and give him some more scoring opportunity. At the very least, he should be putting up his identical numbers of about 19, 12, and 7. We know Hallie isn't playing this year, which is obviously going to hurt the Knights if they aim to make the playoffs, but he's still a great investment for the long term. LeBron may finally be retiring this season, but even that is up in the air, as King James will be 41 and has shown no signs of slowing down. But he will be entering the season for the first time ever, not being the best player on his team and not playing in the preseason opener with his sciatica issue, so he may slightly take a backseat to Luka being in charge as well, but LBJ averaged 34 last season. I'm expecting 30 to 31 fantasy points still for the GOAT. Jarrett Allen is not on the team anymore, and I wish this trade would have been completed during the offseason so I could have secured another keeper, but he worried me a little last year. He was still splendid enough to secure all DBL third team, but 27.6 is the lowest he's put up since being a Knight. He averaged 30 the season prior and would be inconsistent regularly. When he was good, however, he was dominant, and I assume he'll still average 28 fantasy points. It's just sometimes he was frustrating, and Mobley continuing his progression could also hurt Jarrett's numbers. In a similar tier last season was Jakob Poeltl, who was one of the best draft picks of the prior year, averaging 27.5 fantasy points and a stunning career-high turn. This was an anomaly, something we've never seen Poeltl do before, and although he's been an all-star in this league, he's more suited for a 24 fantasy point average than anything. At 30 years old, it'd be surprising to see him actually start to get better, but I could see him only falling to 25 fantasy points, which is still a splendid contributor, especially to get in the draft. The Raptors might screw him and the Knights, though, if they choose to sit him and pass it off as an injury if they're still unethically tanking. DeRozan is the final remaining piece of the Knights' original championship core, a 4-time DBL champ and 2-time All-Star. Debo's best days are definitely behind him. He was electrifying on the Bulls, but he came down to what we expected years ago, averaging 22 fantasy points with the Kings. That's probably mostly due to age, but I think there's a chance that had to do with the Kings being pretty messy last season too. I'm going to estimate a small increase for the 5-time Knight. With Fox gone, he's essentially the go-to scorer on the team again, since we know he's already the alpha to Levine's beta. I'll go with 23.5 fantasy points for what could be DeRozan's final stretch as a Knight. Lastly comes the player that could give the Knights GM of the Year votes or make the case for Joe to make his first all-dumbass team. Cam Whitmore. It's certainly a risky option as a player that's never been good in fantasy and hasn't proven that he's keeper worthy in the slightest. He probably would have been a second, maybe even third round pick in the draft, but in my retooling year, I wanted to get ahead of the curve and hope that he can do special things as a primary scorer in Washington. I'm not expecting 24 fantasy points a game, but Whitmore could crack 20 or even 21, which I would consider a win of a keep if he dramatically improves his numbers. We saw what he could do in limited minutes, so if he gets 30 minutes a game, he should be in line for like 19, 5, and 3 and has the chance to be a Jaylen Brown level player in the future. He could also completely suck and average like 16 fantasy points because the Wizards are a joke and there's no guarantee he's actually starting. However, as the person that decided to go through with this, I believe he's averaging north of 19 fantasy points. In the end, this is the weakest the Knights keepers have ever looked to start a year, and that'd be with Jarrett Allen, who was basically just removed for nothing, at least in terms of a keeper spot. They are in a bit of an awkward position, as just an injury or two to their best players can definitely see them knocked out of the playoffs for the first time ever, and we already know LeBron has been ruled out for about a month. But as I said, Luka, Sabonis, LeBron, that's an insane big three, maybe even the best big three in the league, so if Poeltl and DeRozan can chip in with consistency, this isn't a bad list of keepers at all. It's not great, it's only borderline good, but it's still got firepower and should supplement NJ's framework for the upcoming season. As far as the draft, it's always tricky talking about your own. I'm the one that drafted it, so automatically I have to like it more than most. I don't think it's an all-time draft or anything, and it's not going to finish top 3 for best draft, but for what I'm trying to accomplish this season, I like what I did. I did not have a first rounder, so with the first pick in the second round, the Knights chose Isaiah Collier, and honestly, I was happy to get him here. Maybe I could have swung it to 19, but I didn't really like anyone else on the board more than him. He only averaged 13 fantasy points as a rook, but flashed some tremendous point guard play, all but beating out Keontae George as the one who will run the offense. He averaged 6 assists as a rookie, and I have to imagine he'll develop further. Maybe Walter Clayton comes in and prevents him from getting a bulk of minutes or opportunities, but I think he'll be heavily featured in the backcourt. I'm going to guess 11 points, 7 to 8 assists, and 21 fantasy points for the sophomore. At 19, Paul George is close to completing his DBL journey by playing for almost every franchise in the history of the league. Look, I've heavily knocked him in fantasy for years, and last year was by far his worst. He can't stay healthy and fell all the way down to 20 fantasy points, which is no doubt disgusting, but he's been a keeper every year in the DBL. To get a proven vet in the second round, even if he only puts up 20 a night, is still something worth having. He should be slightly healthier and may even have a chip on his shoulder, but if he's injured and looks even more washed, then it's no real biggie to me. I tried him out in the draft at what I think is a pretty fair place for him to be taken. We'll see if I regret this in 2 months, but I don't think it's a huge deal if it doesn't work out. With the next 3 picks not coming till the 4th round, we start off at number 37 with Jaden McDaniels. Again, this is a guy I've not regularly been a fan of, but he finished last season with a sneaky 18.8 fantasy points thanks to a tremendous stretch at the end of the year. If that can carry over, and it's very possible it doesn't considering he's not yet proven to be worthy of staying on a roster, then he can be as useful as OG Anunoby or possibly even better. For this late in the game, I like the flyer. 2 picks later, I went with Jeremy Sochan, and I like this too. He wound up falling to 18 fantasy points, but there was a long period where it looked like he could be a future keeper. It was only his 3rd year, so this is the kind of prove-it campaign before I write him off as someone that can only put up 11 and 6 for their career. Maybe the most controversial pick was my last when NJ chose Damian Lillard at 47. Despite his age and knowing he's missing the whole season, I was shocked he fell this far, possibly wouldn't even be drafted if not for me. It's no fun keeping a player in your IR all season, which I'm already doing with Halliburton, so this could be very alarming when injuries start stacking up. But again, I'm not really intending to quote-unquote win this year. I want to do well and make the playoffs, but if I get a healthy Dame back for the following season, I can either keep him or trade him away to someone in the offseason. Plus, I drafted him with the intention that I can stash him away and pick up someone else, and when I looked at it through that lens, it's kind of a win-win for me. For the 47th pick, for how good we know Dame is, for the fact I'm not contending, I'm happy to bring him aboard. At the end of the day, I think it's an above-average draft. Collier has some real growth opportunity, I believe George is a decent selection for what he's capable of, and I like the upside of McDaniels and Sochan. But they can literally all be bad this season, and with Dame already taking up room in the IR, it would be a complete waste of a pick if I decided I needed to drop him. This draft needs to be at least somewhat okay if the Knights want to make sure they keep their postseason streak alive. It's hard to imagine this team missing the playoffs, and I think that mainly comes down to the fact that Joe is a 4-time GM of the year. I believe in my skill set as a manager to will this organization to the playoffs and do what's necessary for my retooling of the roster at the same time. The team still has some of the most electrifying fantasy players around, and I wouldn't classify them as a negative core either. It's flawed, it's not great, and they're going to have to work hard, but I think the Knights still have the ability to finish as high as the 3 seed. They could also finish as low as the 7th seed, to be honest, but I think 90% of the league would place their bets on New Jersey making the playoffs again. In 4th place, I have the Las Vegas Whales finishing outside the top 3 in 2026. James once again defied expectations and kept his team in control as the most dominant Western Conference squad we've ever seen. Unfortunately, he had to go up against the Tropics in the semis, failing to make it back to the 3rd finals of his career. James is definitely still in the running to capture his 5th conference title, but what would have given him a better chance is drafting the rest of his team. James missed the draft, which is like crazy, something that's never happened before, and what's more insane than that is the fact that James is still being projected to be the 4th best team. That kind of commitment, though, I think is what separates his roster from having a greater opportunity at securing a championship ring. When we look at his keepers, they're still pretty damn effective, but I'm not necessarily in love with them either. Wemby is in the cards to average 40-plus fantasy points this year. We just have to pray he isn't an injury-riddled star. Towns' move to the Knicks last year was one of the most miraculous fantasy increases I've seen out of a player that wasn't expected. I figured he'd move up about 3 fantasy points, but the fact that he went from 27 in 2024 to 37 in 2025 was just absolutely nuts. I will always be worried with his playtime, as you can usually expect missed time out of Cat, but he's still going to be a top 10 fantasy player this year. Even with a tiny decrease that I suspect to maybe 35 fantasy points, Towns is undoubtedly the Whales' 2nd best player. Harden hasn't lost a step, and it's easy for me to keep saying that's going to happen every season that he gets older, but unless he gets hurt, I don't think the production is going to be too different. The Beard cooked up 23 points, 6 rebounds, and 8 assists to be good enough for over 30 fantasy points. There's a lot of new faces in LA, but I still think he's the first option and star of the show, and yes, I count Kawhi since Leonard can't be trusted with suiting up regularly. I expect at least 28 fantasy points. Bam has never quite hit the highs of either of Vegas' top 3 players, but he is definitely Mr. Consistent, averaging anywhere from 28 to 31 fantasy points since the DBL began. You always hope that he's going to progress or develop and show more, but at this point we should just be thankful for what he's doing. With Jimmy fully gone and Hero out to start the year, maybe he gets some more offensive duties, but I'm going to guess he'll be in line for 29 to 30 fantasy points. An elite top 4 for the Whales, but the bottom half is concerning to me. LaVine should match DeRozan in fantasy output at around 22 to 23 fantasy points. He'll have his stretches and months that display what an offensive juggernaut he really is, but he also isn't going to fill up the box score often, and he's going to have some super cold stretches as well. His best days are behind him, but he can still be a useful fantasy option. Trey Murphy looked like a stud when James acquired him last year, but as is the theme with him and everyone on the Pelicans, he's an injury-prone player that can't stay on the court. Even so, he cooled off last year and wasn't as good as we all remember, finishing with just 22 fantasy points a night. He'll be solid when he plays, but I don't know that he's a future all-star or anything like that unless he can impress us with another step. MPJ has been one of the weirdest fantasy stories over the years, going from constantly injured to promising to awful and everywhere in between. Last season was one of his best, averaging 22.5 fantasy points. Now he'll be the first option on a disastrous Brooklyn squad, and I'm not sure if this hurts or helps his numbers. I'm going to assume around the same production for him in fantasy, because he's just so hard to trust on a year-to-year basis anyway. The final keeper for the Whales was a buzzer-beating keep as James traded for Claxton the day before the deadline. He only gave up a 5th, but I'd rather he kept Miles Bridges, who he overpaid a first-round pick for to obtain only 6 months earlier. He dropped him for nothing and went with Clax, who was god-awful last season. Listen, we see players fluctuate over the years, and Claxton certainly could have just had a randomly terrible season just to fuck with me since I was the one that kept him, but this is a risky move by Vegas since we saw how shitty he was the entire campaign. I mean, he was consistently dog shit. It can be turned around, but I still expect, if anything, 20 fantasy points a night. Overall, not a dominant group in my opinion, but the Vegas staples are so good that I expect the Whales to be a top 3rd team no matter what. There are some injury concerns and players I'm not very high on, but regardless, they should be carried by the likes of Wemby and Towns. Now, when we slide over to the draft, here are my thoughts about the Whales board. Alright, so the Whales I think will finish in 4th place. Now moving on to 3rd, I'm kidding, but not really. The man didn't draft, which is just inexcusable really, but the players he at least picked up in place of missing the draft were D'Lo, Beal, Kuzma, Suggs, and Bryce Sensabaugh. I think they're all mid with a chance of being semi-relevant, but not with much fortitude. D'Lo will be starting now, but is still like the 4th option offensively before Kyrie comes back. Beal is sort of washed and is joining a loaded Clippers team as like the 3rd or 4th option himself. Kuzma was absolute ass water last season and maybe can rectify that slightly with a Bucks team that has no defined second man to Giannis, but I also wouldn't count on him going above 20 fantasy points. Suggs doesn't move me because with Bane there now, his fantasy pertinence continues to diminish in my opinion, and Bryce Sensabaugh, a wild card for Vegas that I don't see being able to crack 20 minutes a night with all the forwards competing for a rotation spot in Utah. These players will be very bland but somewhat serviceable for the Whales. It's kind of impressive he got all of these guys outside of the draft, but they're not that good, that's why they were available. James really shot himself in the foot and crippled his team for the campaign by missing the draft, but it's still remarkable that I think they'll be as good as 3rd in the league and even have a chance to remain the top dogs in the West. Nobody ever nails their entire draft, so James isn't far behind everyone else, but it's still a disservice to his core and fans of Las Vegas. The Whales can finish as low as 6th in my opinion, and possibly even 2nd place, but I don't love the overall composition of the crew, especially when the draft could have improved the roster heavily. With a huge jump in the standings this season, I have the Yellowstone Pronghorns finishing in 3rd place after missing the playoffs the past 2 years. This is both because Alec has wildly improved his roster, and maybe because this is the weakest the DBL has ever looked in my opinion. Still, Alec has progressed as a manager, and his overall team is the most terrorizing it's been yet. Across the board, I'd say Alec has a pretty consistent battalion of players, many of which are very young and haven't hit their ceiling yet. Let's begin with Tyrese Maxey, who put up nearly 27 fantasy points a game and looks like he'll continue to get better. The The Sixers were banged up, so most of the load fell on him when he was available, but the Sixers will still be banged up, and Embiid and PG are regressing as they get older. He is the focal point of their future and will only be 25 by year's end. My next favorite keeper of Alex has to be Duren. Despite an underwhelming campaign that saw him put up 26 a night, he was averaging 22 to 24 for a majority of the season. He should bounce back fully with a hungry Pistons team for somewhere around 29 to 30 fantasy points. Trading Halliburton away may prove to be a risky decision for the Prongs, but getting the best versions of Jaylen Brown and Pascal Siakam we may ever see will be more than enough to have Yellowstone in contender conversations. JB without Tatum is primed to go crazy. I'm going to guess a jump somewhere up to 28 fantasy points. The only fear is that the Celtics wind up being really bad, so Boston sits their star player a lot down the stretch. But he averaged 24 last year, so he should be locked in for going back up to at least 26. As for Siakam, it might not be his best ever season, as I find the time he averaged 30 fantasy points along with 24, 8, and 6 hard to replicate, but with how he's sitting the whole year, Spice needs to do a lot more than he had been doing the past 2 years in Indiana. He was already averaging 25 to 26 alongside the superstar, so I have to assume he's going from 27 and 3 to like 23, 8, and 4 to produce around 27 to 28 fantasy points a night. There is always the chance he continues to slow down as he had been showing the past 2 years, but that is probably largely because he joined a team as the second option instead of the first that he had been the past several seasons. He is the reigning Eastern Conference Finals MVP after all. Next, we'll go with JJJ. Not to beat a dead horse because I say it all the time, but I'm not the biggest fan. He did manage to capture his first ever DBL All-Star appearance, but he cooled off tremendously in the second half of the year to only average 24.7. He can't get boards, and he usually can't stay healthy, but I'd expect a similar campaign for the two-way threat. His ex-teammate in Desmond Bane finds himself in Orlando, where his fantasy game should largely remain the same. He's still going to be the third option, but the days of hoping for All-Star Des are out the window. He should put up 23 fantasy points a night, which is a solid add, but I think we've seen the best of him. We just have to hope that he can also remain on the court. Darius Garland had a mini bounce back last season, averaging 23 fantasy points after previously finishing with 19.4. A 4-point jump is great, but it's scary that he was even that bad to begin with, and he's never been able to eclipse 24 fantasy points. That's just not going to happen as the second or third option in a Cavs offense that is evenly split, so I'd expect around 22 to 23 fantasy points again for the year. Finally comes Markkanen, a complete enigma that is hard for me to properly evaluate. What we know, Alec traded a first for the rights to Lauri, even though he had a dreadful turn at 18.7 fantasy points last year. That sucks. Not even 19 after previously averaging 28 and 30 fantasy points the seasons before is actually an insane drop. On top of that, Lauri is consistently injured, which people seem to forget about. He has never played 70 games and has only played in the 60s twice. So, not a lot to like at this current juncture, but he had one of the craziest FIBA tournaments I've seen, and it could have just been a really bad down year with a Jazz team that didn't know what they were doing. His good years could truly just be a hot 2-year anomaly, but this year will determine that for us. I think he'll return to form, but not to the level we know. Something like 23 to 24 fantasy points a night. In the end, this is the best we've seen out of Alec in the keeper department yet. Adding 2 All-Stars and champions to the roster immediately boosts the quality of the team, and with promising young guys like Maxey and Duren who are already very good, Yellowstone has a legit chance at making some noise. A lot of that will come down to what this second half of keepers do, because while they are good, they've also all kind of hit their ceilings, and many of them are known to miss long periods of time during the year. Alec's draft to me was by far the best board he's put together in his 3 seasons of the DBL. It's not amazing, and it can go wrong in a number of ways, plus he wasn't physically there to draft either, but it's still an improvement over what we've seen before. With the number 10 pick, Alec took Christian Braun. There's big expectations for him this year. After averaging 21 fantasy points last time out, I tried all offseason to move him to a rebuilding team to no avail. Maybe he won't be that much better, but at the very least he should be averaging 21 fantasy points again, and I think it's actually realistic he goes up to about 23. I think people are going to be kicking themselves for not trading for him and for letting him slip to almost the second round. 3 second rounders in a row for the Pronghorns, and while none of them are sexy, I don't really mind them. Con Knipple was the 4th pick in the draft, so he's got to have some semblance of skill and potential. I just really don't know how much we're going to see of that because of this disastrous Hornets organization and the fact that there's a lot of young mouths to feed and the fact that he's a rookie. But if Alec is willing to be patient, which he has often showed he is not, this could be a nice young piece to have. In the complete opposite direction comes Draymond, who I can't remember being taken this high in the draft since before the DBL. He may have been a keeper 1 year or two, but he's managed to be a consistent 19 to 20 fantasy point player for years. He's got his problems, and he probably could have been selected later, but he should continue to provide a steady source of adequate fantasy totals. Then Yellowstone went with another nugget in Aaron Gordon. He had a down campaign at 18 fantasy points last year, but I think his down seasons are closer to his ceiling than his good seasons. He'll probably average somewhere from 19 to 21 fantasy points, which is again a tolerable player to be deploying, even if he's kind of a generic stock fantasy outlet. Lastly, I think Alec got a bit of a steal in the 5th round with Immanuel Quickley. I understand why people neglected to consider him after last year's failure to meet expectations, but he was injured for most of the season and the Raptors were a mess in general. They're still paying him gargantuan bucks to be the point guard of their future, and I think he bounces back quite well. I mean, he averaged 18.8 last year. For the 5th round, that's still pretty good, and I have a sneaking suspicion he could even cross 21 fantasy points, if not higher. Overall, this draft really is a solid collective of pieces. Alec went young with a few selections while also choosing vets and proven players that can be useful in some way. It's the perfect storm of his youth movement combining with the label of probable contender. There's question marks around this team and even a handful around Alec as a manager, but I think it'd be silly to believe Yellowstone doesn't at the very least finally cross that threshold and lock up a playoff spot, even if that's the 6th seed. It could be an even better year than that, but it'll be awesome to see this squad raise their floor and progress to put Alec in MIP conversations. After winning just a singular game in the 23-24 season, the Gems have put themselves in a position 2 years later to be the only team that can possibly be a threat to Flint, Michigan. After busting into the playoffs last season with a team that was ahead of schedule, Ant built on that and assembled a roster that's ready to go toe-to-toe with the Tropics, and just like them, they're incredibly young and we haven't seen the best of their players yet. This is a pretty stacked list of ballers that really only has the injury bug standing in the way. Giddey showed what he can finally do when he gets to man the offense full time, making all DBL 3rd team last year at 27.5 fantasy points. That should only increase with LaVine out of the picture all year. Expect around 17, 8, and 8 for around 30 fantasy points for the 2-time DBL champ. Scotty is the franchise cornerstone though, who was a 30 fantasy point guy himself a few seasons ago, but took a slight dip to 27. It's possible that stays stagnant or goes down a little with Ingram appearing in Toronto, but I have faith he'll actually improve as he's still just 24. Jalen Johnson is another player that has not been on the court much the past 2 years, but he's been phenomenal when playing, last season surpassing 31 fantasy points and being voted in as a DBL All-Star. That's an area he's going to have to be better in, literally playing, because if not, I'm probably going to have to bow out after 3 straight years being sidelined. He should continue to be very resourceful when in the game though. I don't know if he can continue to skyrocket with greater production, but I don't see why he can't do something in the same stratosphere he was already operating in, even with Porzingis in Atlanta now. Speaking of injuries, hey Zion, look, I've said the same shit the past 5 years. I don't think he'll play much, but when he does, he'll hover around 30 fantasy points. With BI and CJ officially gone, he's truly the last one standing to get buckets, but that won't matter much when he isn't on the court either. 43, 19, and 44. Those might be the points Mark Williams puts up in consecutive games this season, but they'll also likely be the only games he plays, as those are all the times he suited up the past 3 years. That is absolute ass. Nothing tells me he'll play over 50 games this year, and there's a reason the Lakers sent him back to Charlotte. He put up 28 fantasy points and has the potential to actually pass 30, but if he is only playing 30 games a year, it really doesn't matter. This is an all-or-nothing prove-it campaign on the Suns, so hopefully he can do what we all know he's capable of. Kel'el Ware, on the other hand, Ant snagged from Mark over the offseason. Ware was one of the most productive and surprising rooks, averaging 18 fantasy points in his debut season. He should be a full-time starter at either the PF or center position, and with injuries to Hero and Jimmy gone, the Heat needs someone to step up. I believe Ware is shooting up to at least 24 fantasy points this year. The last 2 keepers are Zach Edey and Dyson Daniels. Edey was kind of the consensus number 1 overall pick in the DBL draft, and while 19 fantasy points for a newcomer is pretty darn good, it was still disappointing as our expectations were larger for the big fella. He was in and out of the lineup and didn't always get a ton of minutes, so if he starts and puts up a healthy workload, Edey should be beasting and feasting to around 13 and 10. I'm a little concerned about his body already starting the year on the IR, but he's certainly likely to improve and reach around 24 fantasy points as well. Finally comes arguably the biggest steal of the draft, which is ironic since Dyson Daniels is the great barrier thief. I think Dice is actually likely to regress. 24 last year was pretty awesome, but with a more developed Risache, KP, and Jalen Johnson all filling out the roster, I don't think that he's going to be able to replicate a season that good. I think he'll fall to 22 fantasy points, but who knows? Maybe he'll improve on what he already started. I know I said who knows, but this is the most enticing the Gems core has ever looked. He's had more dominant players before with the likes of Trae Young, Joel Embiid, and a 34 fantasy point Whiteside in year one, but the entire keeper crew is more fleshed out than we're used to. I have some major worries about some of their injuries, and it's possible they don't all take that next step we want some of the youngins to take, but the fact that they're all still youthful and have a lot more seasons left in them makes this an even scarier threat than you'd think. If they all pan out and play, it could be Ant's year. Making New York's argument even better is the fact that they had themselves an applause-worthy draft. They got the best player available in Jimmy Butler, who obviously has some health concerns and is now 36 years old, but he should still average a healthy 24-plus fantasy points. I was worried that the Gems might go young here or skip on Jimmy, but they did the right thing by scooping him up as soon as possible. In the third round, the Gems had to bring back DeJounte Murray after things turned out poorly last season. I don't love it, as the Gems are trying to compete and Murray will likely be held out until January, and even then he's going to be very slowly acclimated into game shape, but it's still a solid reinforcement that could prove worth it by the time the playoffs roll around. He'll be in his IR for a while though, and that's always a tough pill to swallow, and he might not even be good, but for the third round, Murray could be a steal. Remaining in the third round, Ant selected Kyle Filipowski, and I think this was a good pick. He didn't take him too early, and if there's anyone else on the Jazz out of all their young players that have the chance to break out, it's him. He's not guaranteed a fat workload or that he's even necessarily rosterable for a DBL team yet, but he went off in the summer league and flashed some serious potential in the climax of the NBA year. In the fourth, the Gems elected to choose Nemby, and this is another case of Halliburton being out and someone having to pick up the slack again. He could shift over to the 1 or just keep playing the 2 and have his scoring and playmaking opportunities skyrocket. After I picked him last year and he burned me, I'm still cautious about him, but if he's ever going to take that next step, this is the time to do so. Another team missing a player is the Celtics, and I don't mean Tatum, they don't have a fucking center. Neemias Queta is projected to step into that starting role, so Ant may have found one of the biggest steals of the draft, honestly, if he's able to get a bulk of those minutes. I'm a little fearful that he could be mid or have his minutes split between God knows who, but it's worth a shot since there's no defined 5 in this Boston front court. Lastly, the Gems seem to have gotten another steal with Jrue Holiday in the 5th round. I get that he's kind of washed and old and only put up 16 fantasy points last year, but I don't know, on this young Blazers team that could probably use some scoring, why can't he go up to 19 or 20 fantasy points? For the 5th round, who cares? This is a good pick. Overall, many of these players could amount to nothing, but at least there's a certified fantasy bucket getter in Jimmy Butler who is surrounded by the potential of others to be greater. Ant's team is already one of the better cores as currently fabricated, so even if this draft doesn't fully pan out, it's not going to hurt too badly. I expect the New York Gems to be hungry and in full force. It's tangible that they finished as low as 4th with their injury-riddled players, and Ant will have to prevent himself from making any out-of-left-field moves, but with the league feeling seemingly weaker than normal, I expect the Gems to be the second best team in the league and facing the Tropics in the finals. The rebuild is over, Ant. It's time to put New York on the map. Although the Knights had a dominant run and nobody can take away their history, the 2026 Tropics are starting to look like the greatest team the league has ever seen. After already being a practically unbeatable team and winning the chip with ease, Cam only made the team better by obtaining the NBA's MVP in SGA. Pairing him up with Giannis and the rest of Cam's core, which hasn't even hit its prime yet, should place the Tropics comfortably in first, miles ahead the rest of the competition. Giannis was already the second best DBL performer last year, and now there isn't shit on the team around him. We might actually see the best version of Giannis we've ever seen, which is a crazy thing to imagine. Next to him is SGA, who averaged 37 fantasy points last year. If this isn't the best duo in the league, it's at least top 2. But when you see what the rest of the roster is made up of, it doesn't matter if they're the best duo because they're the best 8 keepers by far. Sengun put up 19, 10, 5, and 30 fantasy points last year. He's only 23. Although KD is coming in, he's still going to drop similar stats, if not even improve slightly. Trae is one of the best point guards in the league in DBL, and even if he's hit his ceiling years ago, that's an amazing peak that has continued with consistency over the course of Delta Beta Lambda. He should be in line for nearly 30 fantasy points again, and Paolo Banchero is likely going to inch close to that himself. At 26 last year, he cooled off, but I expect 28 to 29 fantasy points as he gets acclimated to being the leader of this Orlando unit. Ant-Man should also get another year closer to averaging 30. Year in and year out, he bumps his average up as little as possible, but he's still getting there. I don't know if he's ever going to be an SGA level fantasy player, maybe not even a mid-30s guy, but if he can finally reach 30, I'd be so much higher on him. He's still fantastic, durable, and SGSF, and can pop off for a massive game any day. The last two keepers round out the Thunder's big three, and Cam owns all of them, J-Dub and Chet Holmgren. J-Dub should be in the same ballpark of 26 fantasy points, but he's also gotten better every year, so he can surely develop even more. I just think that OKC is comfortable with what they have after coasting to a championship, so I don't know that they switch up the game plan of anything too much that sees Williams or Chet get too much better, but if either of them will, it's going to be Chet. He was an all-star and all-DBL in his first season, but after being banged up, he fell to 25 fantasy points, which is an absurd thing to say out loud that we were all underwhelmed by that performance. There's no doubt that he can build on that 27 fantasy point season and reach the 30-point threshold, but what he needs to prove first is that he can suit up most of the schedule. If he can do that at 25 fantasy points, I'd take that over 30 fantasy points through 30 games. We know the talent is there and he can soar to new heights, but just play first, then worry about all the rest. In the end, yeah, no one's touching this core. Even the best Knights years probably weren't ever this good. The only nitpick is that Chet can be injury prone. Everyone else, amazing and still getting better for like 5 out of 8 of them. We still don't know what the peak of this roster is, and that is absolutely terrifying. Surprisingly, I'm actually not very high on Cam's draft. It's probably his weakest board ever to me, which is not saying much since he's a goated drafter, but at least if it isn't as good as I'm thinking, this is the perfect year to whiff on the draft with such a ruthless roster. Miles Bridges was an excellent choice, and I'm not sure how the DBL keeps letting these should-be obviously drafted players fall to the Tropics, but maybe the rest of the league didn't want to join Josh, James, and Ed as part of their prestigious club, the Women Beaters, but still, Bridges is debatably the best player on the Hornets. At 22, Cam then took Danny Gaff, who was good in the minutes he plays, but with AD, Lively, and a plethora of forwards in the rotation, it might be hard for him to make much of a difference. However, all of those centers are injury prone, including Gafford, who's starting the year on the sidelines, so he can carve himself out a solid role. Even if he only plays 18 minutes, he basically averages a fantasy point per minute, so it's not an awful pick by any means. In the third round, Cam took Benny Math at 30. Just like every Pacer we've discussed in this video, he may dramatically improve his production and finally break out. I don't know why, but I'm kind of over him, although I understand why Cam went with this choice. He averaged 17 last year, so he could bump that up just 2 fantasy points to remain a relevant contributor, but just like everyone else, if he's gonna improve, this is the time to do so. If not, I will officially be out on Benedict. In the same round, Cam got Tobias Harris, and although he may only average 19 to 20 fantasy points, he will do so consistently. He was phenomenal in that role player responsibility for fantasy purposes, and if he can keep that up, he's a fantastic appendage for this Michigan team. Skipping the fourth round and taking us all the way to number 58, Cam took Jalen Wells, which I could understand the logic behind to some degree, but it felt like a missed opportunity to go with a more proven guy in Aldama, who was pretty useful last season alone. Wells has already been dropped, which proves to me this is in fact one of the weaker drafts the Tropics have finalized, but it's not out of the realm of possibility for him to be a decent streamer either. In the end, this really isn't a bad draft, it just feels a teensy bit underwhelming since we know how insane of a drafter Cam usually is. Also, none of it fucking matters because he's gonna blow every team out of the water this season with his eyes closed. The core is next level, the draft was still solid all things considered, and Cam is an immaculate GM who will continue to tinker with the roster to make it as perfect as possible. The only real question I have for the Tropics is, can they surpass the 17-2 all-time record and get 18 plus regular season wins this year? I think it's certainly in the cards. It's gonna be a great season, but we are not done yet. It's awards time. My finals predict is Tropics Gems, with the Tropics repeating for their second chip. Obviously, Tropics taking home the ECT, and yeah, Alec and the Pronghorns obtaining their first ever Western Conference title, although James could easily wind up with his 5th as the greatest franchise to ever come out of the West Coast. Sexiest keepers has to be Cam also. The team won last year, and they just added SGA, So Gorgeous, or Rosander. James and the Whales may have a shot with some hot-ass men over there too, but I think the Trops are dominating on and off the court. Most improved is a two-way race as it usually is, but it's the same exact people I predicted last year, Ant and Alec. Ant won last season, but he has the chance to go from fringe playoff squad to title contender, so he's definitely in the running. But I'm going to flip it and go with Alec this time. He is right behind Ant in my standings, and he missed the playoffs last year, so it's likely to be the bigger improvement if the team is around the level I think it can be. Plus, Ant just won last season, so I think the league will want to reward someone else. Is there a possibility anyone else can get this award? Like, not really, maybe Josh somehow if he wins like 8 games, which I think is way too high of a mark for him to reach, so I'm gonna lock in Alec. Our brand new award, the Trip W waiver wire winner, is obviously something sort of impossible to predict. I don't know who's gonna pick up who and who's gonna be good, otherwise I'd pick them up now. But I'll work with what I know and what we've got so far, and I'm going to choose myself for a few reasons. I typically nab rosterable guys every year, whether that's a must-own or a decent end-of-bench player, and I already picked up some people with my injuries to Hallie, Dame, and Koulibaly, who would also count as a pickup. I think Aldama can be over 20 fantasy points too. Plus, I may be dropping guys left and right with my somewhat experimental season, so I think it gives me a good chance to be in the running for the award. I'd say Cam deserves to be there because he's always active with some good pickups too, and maybe some rebuilding squads such as Eric or Mark because there could potentially be a lot of turnover with their rosters. I wouldn't vote James for this, or at least consider the guys he picked up for his quote-unquote draft if they wound up being good, since it's a weird gray area and I don't know what I want to reward him with a $25 bonus for being a no-show to the draft, but technically I did like those players as pickups. I just don't think he deserves it. Weird award to predict, but I will stick with myself in the long run. Awarding best draft is often a 180 from the beginning of the year, but I'd say right now it's between Josh, Ed, and Ant. There's other good boards that can be swayed into a more positive direction, and these ones could all take a downward spiral as the year goes on, but I wouldn't say there's an absolute killer board from anyone straight out of the gate this season. I guess I'll go with Josh because if we take the Wemby approach, that won James' best draft a few seasons ago for just having the first overall pick and getting the coveted rookie we all wish we had. But at least on top of that, the McLovins took a plethora of rookies with upside and star potential. Not that they'll all be good right away, but at least most of them should show some promise and can be enticing surrounded by Coop, who's already expected to make waves. I do really like Ed's draft as a new member in this league though. Maybe voters will be impressed with what he was able to do as a first-year GM. All his players just have to be as good as last season with the exception of KPJ turning it up and Kaman Malak displaying some sort of relevance. I like some other drafts, but it's hard to convincingly back anyone else as much at this moment. I'm gonna say the league votes Josh after a years-long rebuild starts to come to fruition. Here comes the negative ones. Who is going to be a part of the 2026 All Dumbass class? I think there's a lot of potential for a handful of people to be considered this year, but first I have to go with James. Not typically a guy you'd expect on this list since his team's good and he doesn't usually do anything stupefyingly dumb, but unfortunately completely missing the draft may be the most stupefyingly dumb thing that has ever happened in DBL history. Voters are going to hold that against him, especially if his team doesn't wind up looking so good. It will basically be a direct correlation with him failing to manage his team in the simplest way. He also didn't keep Miles Bridges and dropped him for nothing when he paid a first for him in this very calendar year. And according to the draft, James wouldn't have gotten anything for Lillard anyway, but I don't like that the Whales essentially traded him for nothing. Unless he has a miraculously good year again and doesn't make any more mistakes along the way, he may be safe, but you can all but lock him into my all dumbass ballot. Secondly, and this is tough, but I have to assume Mark will be receiving some unfortunate hardware. I don't think the league really likes to vote new members as all dumbass so much, since we understand it's not fair, but sometimes there's not a lot of competition, and sometimes too many things pile up and they have to be faulted for them. There were already some questionable moves, like trading a lot for Josh Hart and trading away Kel'el Ware for Westbrook, who was not on an NBA roster, but I think the Pritchard trade put things over the top for most, and while Jarrett Allen is an all DBL player, he mortgaged his future with 3 firsts and made things look a little grim in Kyoto. You have to expect more mistakes along the way in a learning curve circumstance for the Demons, so I think it's safe to say he will be joining James come award season. Lastly, there's a bunch of names left to attack. Can it be myself for keeping Cam Whitmore and choosing to retool after coming off the best record in the league? Can it be Josh for what is likely going to be another crushing season? What about Eric for what is probably going to be a 2-win year for the Rebels? Gary because he was all dumbass in 2025 and is probable to miss the playoffs again with no legit vision for the team? Ed, who still doesn't have a team name with the season starting tomorrow? I think they're all on the table, but if I had to guess right now, I'm actually going to say Mike. This might be the year the Grapes miss the playoffs entirely, which wouldn't be good considering the team should supposedly be getting better with every passing season. Drafting Reed Shepherd and Scoot Henderson in the first round makes it even more likely this is a lottery team, and it might just anger people if another year of prime Jokic is wasted and not on their respective rosters. I don't know, there's a whole 19 games ahead of us to see what every member will do well or poorly, so I don't think it's, set in stone. I think it's partially wide open, but gun to my head, I envision Mike on the 2026 All Dumbass team right now. Dumbass of the year then to me has to be one of these three, and it's gotta be James. I think it's close between him and Mark as of right now, but I think people are likely to be more forgiving with Mark being new, taking on an expansion team, and the fact that he applies a lot of effort and commitment, especially so early on in his DBL career. James missing the draft communicates a more lethargic approach to fantasy, where one doesn't care as much to really better his team or try. I think that might not sit well with voters, so again, unless he really turns the ship around, James may be in line for his second Dumbass of the Year, an award that has never had a repeat winner. Basing Trader of the Year solely off of the history of Season 7 so far, I think Cam wins after getting SGA without giving up a first-round pick. We didn't think the Tropics could add any more talent. We know they are young and still getting better, but we didn't think another keeper that was the MVP of the league would be joining the reigning champs, so it's hard to beat that, although I've done a pretty impressive job myself of making not only a multitude of trades, but some big blockbusters, and the season hasn't even begun. Hallie and a ton of draft capital for players that have probably already peaked, and 3 juicy firsts for two-time DBL All-Star Jarrett Allen, not to mention a lot of smaller deals that took place over the summer. If Cam Whitmore pans out too, I also gave up barely anything to acquire him. Perhaps it'll look really bad, but we've got a whole schedule ahead of us still, and the Knights currently have 13 first-round picks. You know they've got quite a lot left that they want to accomplish. I want to toss Josh's name out there too, because he also has a ton of draft picks, and this might be the season he really starts using them to help flesh out his core, as well as trading away some of the youthful talent he doesn't wish to move forward with, but doubting a 4-time Trader of the Year is foolish in my opinion, so I'm choosing Joe to take home his 5th. For GM of the Year, I simply can't predict myself again, even if I have the best managed campaign of the season. If I'm already getting Trader of the Year, I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell I also get a 5th GM of the Year in the same season that I probably won't even be finishing as a top 3 team. I'm going with Cam for this. He's got the best team, the best roster, pretty much the best everything, and adding SGA was the sprinkles on top. He cannot make an adjustment to his roster, and I'd say he was the best GM of the year for that. I think Ant has a solid chance of sneaking his way in there if he dominates and continues to make the right calls. I certainly foresee a world in which he grabs it from up under the Trops. I think I'll always be in the conversation as well, but maybe league members won't understand why I low-key blew up a title contender, and regardless, the fatigue is there. It's between Cam and Ant, and I'm going Cam. For our 3 all-fantasy selections, Cam is a shoo-in, and no need to go into any more detail there. My second one I kind of want to lock in too, as I have Ant getting his first all-fantasy since 2021. I think he's going to be the second best team, and on top of that, manage it very well throughout the year. This last one, though, is going to be a tough one. I definitely have Alec in consideration with the MIP-type performance I expect from him, as well as being the 3rd best team in the league. I have to skip over James since I think he's going to be cast as Dumbass of the Year, and the 5th place team in my standings are the Knights. I have to choose myself as the final slot because, for one, I've never missed an all-fantasy team in my career, and if it's between me and Alec, I think I'll have the better managed campaign overall with more meaningful trades, pickups, and ideas implemented to get the wheels turning for the future of NJ. It could all go horribly wrong. LeBron has already been ruled out, like we said, to start the year, but it's also hard to choose someone else since I was voted onto 6 straight. I wouldn't be surprised if Alec made it, but anyone else for this upcoming season, I would be shocked. I think the East is representing the 2026 class. Finally comes MVP, and let's not drag this out, it's Cam and the Tropics. They have the chance to have the best regular season record we've ever seen. Despite the Gems being in the running for one of the best teams in the league, I don't think there's any legit competition for this award. Time to see what happens, and you will all be sending your ballots to me as well, and see how your predictions stack up with the closest winning a gift at the end of the year. Let's have another legendary season, Delta Bates. DBL.